The tension in Courtroom 3A of the Federal District Court in Portland was palpable. Attorneys shuffled papers nervously as Judge Mustafa Kasubhai entered, his expression unreadable beneath his composed judicial demeanor. The gallery was packed with observers, reporters, and community members. All gathered for what many had expected to be a routine hearing on a controversial voting rights case. No one, least of all Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, seated at the plaintiff's table, anticipated what would happen next. Before we proceed with today's hearing, Judge Kasubhai began, greater than his voice resonating through the hushed courtroom. I feel compelled to address something extraordinary that occurred in the filings for this case. The judge removed his glasses and looked directly at Congresswoman Crockett. In my 15 years on the bench, I have never witnessed an attorney display such remarkable courage in the face of what can only be described as deliberate intimidation. A murmur swept through the courtroom. The defense counsel shifted uncomfortably. Judge Kasubhai, an Obama appointee known for his measured temperament and scrupulous fairness, rarely made personal comments during proceedings. The threatening messages Congresswoman Crockett received after filing this voting rights case were reprehensible. He continued, yet instead of withdrawing, she not only persisted, but incorporated those very threats as evidence of the chilling effect on voting rights. That level of moral courage deserves recognition regardless of how I ultimately rule on the legal merits of this case. What happened next stunned everyone present. As Judge Kasubhai finished speaking, something unprecedented occurred in the typically formal federal courtroom as spontaneous. A reaction that would be reported in law schools and media outlets nationwide. It's moments like these, stories of courage and principle in America's justice system remind us what's possible when public servants stand firm against intimidation. The case before Judge Kasubhai had begun 3 months earlier, brought several civil rights organizations, represented by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, in her capacity as an attorney, filed a lawsuit challenging recent changes to voting procedures in a rural county. These changes had dramatically reduced polling locations in predominantly minority neighborhoods while leaving others untouched. Before entering Congress, Crockett had built a distinguished career as a civil rights attorney, winning several landmark cases involving voting access. Despite her congressional responsibilities, she had agreed to represent plaintiffs in this case pro bono, citing its fundamental importance to democratic participation. Judge Mustafa Kasubhai brought a unique perspective to the federal bench appointed in 2019. He was the first Muslim American federal judge in Oregon's history. His background included years as a workers' compensation judge and circuit court judge, where he had earned widespread respect for his meticulous attention to legal detail and even-handedness in politically charged cases. I took an oath to apply the law equally to all who appear before me, regardless of their status or my personal opinions. He often reminded lawyers in his courtroom. In this court, the only thing that matters is evidence and legal reasoning. The controversy surrounding the case escalated dramatically 2 weeks before the hearing. Congresswoman Crockett began receiving threatening messages after a local radio host criticized her involvement in the lawsuit sent to both her congressional office and personal email. The messages contained explicit threats and racial slurs. It makes one wonder, what do you think about the increasing threats public servants face today as political intimidation crossed a dangerous line in our democracy? Sharing perspectives on protecting civil discourse and public safety is more important than ever. Rather than withdrawing from the case, as the anonymous intimidators clearly hoped, Crockett made an unexpected legal move. She amended the complaint to include the threatening messages as evidence of the chilling effect that voting restrictions combined with intimidation could have on minority voters' willingness to participate in the democratic process. Experts immediately recognized the strategic brilliance of this approach. By incorporating the threats into the legal complaint, Crockett transformed personal intimidation into relevant evidence. The move not only strengthened the legal argument but also created a public record of the intimidation tactics being employed. This case isn't just about polling place locations, she explained to reporters outside the courthouse after filing the amended complaint. It's about whether our democracy allows all citizens to participate without fear. The threats I've received simply underscore what many voters and marginalized communities already experience, the message that their participation is unwelcome. The amended filing generated national attention. Legal blogs praised its creative approach to addressing intimidation. Civil rights organizations cited it as a model for responding to increasingly common threats against voting rights advocates. Even conservative legal scholars, while disagreeing with the underlying claims, acknowledge the tactical sophistication of incorporating the threats into the case itself. The defense team representing the county election board found themselves in an uncomfortable position. While they had legitimate arguments supporting the polling place changes based on budget constraints and population shifts, they now face the additional challenge of distancing themselves from the threatening messages without appearing to dismiss their seriousness. As the hearing date approached, security at the federal courthouse was heightened. U.S. Marshals conducted additional screening. Judge Kasubhai requested additional security measures, not out of personal concern, but to ensure all participants felt safe in his courtroom. The morning of the hearing, the courtroom filled early. Civil rights advocates sat alongside local citizens concerned about government overreach. Law students occupied several rows, notebooks ready to record what many professors had described as a textbook example of creative legal advocacy in voting rights cases. What no one anticipated was the judge's opening remarks or the extraordinary response they would provoke. As Judge Kasubhai entered the courtroom, the gallery rose according to protocol. The judge nodded to the attorneys and took his seat, arranging his papers methodically, as was his custom. Those familiar with his courtroom recognized his thorough preparation. Case files tabbed and annotated, relevant precedents flagged for quick reference. "You may be seated," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. As the rustle of movement subsided, he looked up at the packed courtroom, came brief eye contact with various participants before delivering his unexpected opening remarks, reiterating the sentiments he'd expressed moments earlier. He removed his glasses and looked directly at Congresswoman Crockett again. In my 15 years on the bench, I've never witnessed an attorney display such remarkable courage in the face of what can only be described as deliberate intimidation. The threatening messages Congresswoman Crockett received after filing this voting rights case were reprehensible. Yet instead of withdrawing, she not only persisted but incorporated those very threats as evidence of the chilling effect on voting rights. That level of moral courage deserves recognition regardless of how I ultimately rule on the legal merits of this case. Judge Kasubhai continued, his voice measured but firm. This court stands unequivocally for the proposition that intimidation of attorneys for their advocacy is an assault on the rule of law itself. Every attorney must be free to represent their clients zealously without fear of personal threats. This principle transcends political divisions and goes to the heart of our legal system. Janet Miller, a retired federal prosecutor seated in the second row, later told reporters, "I've been in courtrooms for 30 years and never witnessed anything like it." You could feel the atmosphere change as people recognized this wasn't about politics, but about defending the fundamental integrity of our legal system. As the applause finally subsided, Congresswoman Crockett remained at the podium, visibly moved but maintaining her professional composure. When the courtroom quieted, she addressed the court one final time. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "If I may, I'd like to acknowledge that whatever courage I've shown pales in comparison to that displayed by ordinary citizens who face far greater barriers and risks in exercising their voting rights. They are the true inspiration for this case." This redirection of attention from herself to the communities she represented demonstrated why she had earned such respect, even from those who disagreed with her politics. By transforming personal recognition into advocacy for her clients, she reinforced the central purpose of the case itself. Judge Kasubhai nodded in acknowledgement. "Your point is well taken, Congresswoman. This court recognizes that attorneys serve as voices for those whose own voices might otherwise go unheard in our legal system." Before adjourning, Judge Kasubhai made one additional statement that further elevated the proceedings beyond typical legal arguments. This court has a responsibility not just to apply the law but to protect the legal process itself. When attorneys face threats for their advocacy, it threatens not just individual rights but the functioning of our entire system of justice. Such intimidation if left unrest creates exactly the kind of chilling effect on participation that voting rights laws seek to prevent. With that he closed the hearing. Court is adjourned. The impact of the moment continued as people filed out of the courtroom. Small groups formed spontaneously in the hallway, engaging in thoughtful conversation that crossed typical political divides. A county official was overheard speaking with a civil rights advocate about practical transportation solutions for affected voters. A conservative attorney engaged a progressive law student in discussion about the strategic brilliance of incorporating threats into legal arguments. Professor James Wilson, a constitutional law expert who had observed the proceedings, gathered his students in the courthouse plaza. "What you witnessed today transcends the specific legal questions in this case," he told them. Judge Kasubhai demonstrated how courts can affirm fundamental democratic values while maintaining judicial neutrality on contested legal questions. Congresswoman Crockett showed how advocates can respond to intimidation not with retreat, but with innovative legal strategy that transforms threats into evidence, strengthening their case. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Congresswoman Crockett. Rather than focusing on the legal details, most questions addressed the extraordinary courtroom moment and Judge Kasubhai's recognition. "Congresswoman, how do you respond to the judge's comments about your courage?" asked a reporter from the local newspaper. Crockett's response maintained the same principled focus she had demonstrated throughout. Judge Kasubhai's remarks were generous. But what matters most isn't personal recognition, but the fundamental issues at stake in this case. Voter access isn't a partisan issue, but a democratic one. Every American deserves equal opportunity to participate in our electoral system without unnecessary barriers or intimidation. When asked specifically about the spontaneous applause, Crockett reflected thoughtfully. "What moved me wasn't personal validation, but seeing that across our political differences, Americans still share fundamental values about democracy and the rule of law. That gives me hope that we can address even our most difficult challenges if we focus on these shared principles rather than partisan advantage." A reporter from a conservative news outlet asked whether the threats had made her consider withdrawing from the case. Crockett's answer revealed both her personal courage and strategic thinking. "Honestly, yes. I considered it briefly, not out of fear for myself, but concern about potential distraction from the core legal issues. But then I realized that intimidation affecting advocates is exactly analogous to intimidation affecting voters. By incorporating these threats into our legal argument rather than retreating from them, we strengthen the case by demonstrating in real time the chilling effect that intimidation combined with structural barriers creates." Her candid acknowledgement of vulnerability followed by an explanation of her strategic response earned respect even from media outlets typically critical of her politics. The authenticity of her answer, admitting initial concern before explaining her principled response, resonated with viewers across the political spectrum. Across the plaza, defense attorney Richardson demonstrated similar professionalism when approached by reporters. "While we maintain that the county's actions were legally justified by legitimate constraints, we join Judge Kasubhai in condemning any intimidation directed at opposing counsel. The legal system functions only when all parties can advocate their positions without fear." When pressed on whether he agreed with the spontaneous applause, Richardson showed remarkable statesmanship. "Some might consider it a breach of courtroom decorum. But in this instance, I believe it reflected something important. Recognition that certain principles transcend our political differences. My clients oppose Congresswoman Crockett's legal arguments, but absolutely support her right to make them without intimidation. That's a value all Americans should share. By mid-afternoon, law professors nationwide were already incorporating the events into their teaching. Professor Elena Martinez at Georgetown Law sent an email to her professional responsibility students with video clips from the hearing, noting, "Today we witnessed a perfect example of how advocates can respond to intimidation with both courage and strategic brilliance." Congresswoman Crockett's incorporation of threatening messages into the legal argument itself represents innovative advocacy of the highest order. By evening, video clips of the courtroom applause had spread across social media. The hashtag Courage in Court began trending nationally, with Americans from across the political spectrum sharing the clip alongside reflections on democratic values that transcend partisan division. News outlets from across the political spectrum covered the story, most focusing on the rare moment of unity the proceedings had produced rather than the partisan aspects of the underlying case. CNN's legal analyst noted, "What we witnessed today transcends the specific legal questions in this voting rights case. Judge Kasubhai's recognition of advocacy, courage, and the spontaneous response it generated remind us that certain principles, the rule of law, the right to representation without intimidation, remain values that can unite Americans across political divides." Fox News, often critical of progressive voting rights litigation, surprised viewers with their legal correspondence assessment. Whatever one thinks about the underlying case, the conduct of these proceedings demonstrates the best of our legal tradition. Judge Kasubhai maintained strict neutrality on the legal questions. While standing firmly for the integrity of the legal process itself, Congresswoman Crockett showed how principled advocacy can be both passionate and professional. Local radio host Marvin Wells, whose criticism had preceded the threatening messages, used his afternoon program to distance himself from the intimidation tactics. "I strongly disagree with the Congresswoman's position on voting regulations," he stated. "But threatening an attorney for representing their clients is unacceptable in a democracy. We should challenge ideas with better ideas, not intimidation." That evening, several prominent legal organizations issued statements commending both Judge Kasubhai's balanced approach and Congresswoman Crockett's innovative advocacy. The American Bar Association president noted, "Today's proceedings remind us that the rule of law depends on advocates willing to represent their clients zealously, despite personal risk, and courts willing to protect the integrity of legal processes while maintaining neutrality on the legal questions presented." As evening fell, legal experts on television panels discussed the significance of the day's events. Harvard Law professor Martha Feldman observed what Judge Kasubhai did today was remarkable in its balance. Recognizing the courage displayed by Congresswoman Crockett while explicitly separating that recognition from his evaluation of the legal merits. He demonstrated how courts can affirm fundamental democratic values without compromising judicial neutrality. Stanford Law professor James Chan added, "Congresswoman Crockett's legal strategy deserves study in every law school. When faced with intimidation, she didn't retreat or respond with counterattacks. Instead, she incorporated the threats into her legal argument itself, transforming personal attacks into evidence, strengthening her case. That's advocacy of the highest order." Perhaps most significantly, by late evening, the county commissioners held an emergency session to discuss the case. After a 3-hour close meeting, they emerged with a surprising announcement. Rather than waiting for the court's ruling, they would work directly with community representatives to develop a compromise plan for polling locations that would address the concerns raised in the lawsuit while respecting budget constraints. "Today's court proceedings reminded us that ensuring voter access transcends partisan politics," said Commissioner Sarah Johnson, a conservative who had previously defended the polling place reductions. "While we maintain the county acted legally, we recognize the importance of ensuring all citizens can participate in our democracy without undue burden. We're committed to finding solutions that work for all our communities." This unexpected development. Direct dialogue replacing adversarial litigation represented perhaps the most meaningful response to the day's events. The spontaneous applause in Courtroom 3A had somehow created space for collaboration that partisan positioning had previously prevented. The impact of Judge Kasubhai's recognition in the courtroom's response extended far beyond the specific voting rights case. In the days following the hearing, analysis and coverage increasingly shifted from the partisan aspects of voting regulations to the broader principles the incident had highlighted. Law schools requested court transcripts to incorporate into professional ethics courses. The exchange between Judge Kasubhai and Congresswoman Crockett became required reading in classes on legal advocacy, judicial ethics, and voting rights litigation. Professors highlighted how Crockett's incorporation of the threatening messages into the legal argument itself represented innovative advocacy that transformed personal attacks into evidence, strengthening her case. The American Bar Association issued a statement 3 days after the hearing. "The events in Judge Kasubhai's courtroom remind us that the legal profession's highest calling is the courage to advocate zealously despite personal risk. When attorneys face intimidation for representing their clients, the proper response isn't retreat, but redoubled commitment to the rule of law." National security experts and